This is Based in Fact, a true crime podcast. Join host Lisa O'Brien as she examines America's most infamous true crime cases through the lens of the court, not the court of public opinion. No spin, no theories, no rumors, just facts. Here's Lisa O'Brien.
In episode 9, Kyle and I are talking about State of Texas versus Melissa Elizabeth Lucio. Lucio was convicted and sentenced to death in connection with the February 17th, 2007 death of her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah Alvarez. During a 5-hour interrogation, Lucio admitted to investigators that she'd abused Mariah and denied that her husband or children inflicted the many bruises and injuries observed on Mariah's body. Lucio also insisted that Mariah's fatal injuries were sustained 2 days before her death in a fall downstairs. Recently, the Innocence Project has inserted itself into the case, claiming Mariah was never abused by Lucio and bringing in experts to bolster their claim that Mariah's fatal injuries and the extensive bruising observed on her body were the result of a fall and a clotting disorder. We'll talk about the evidence against Lucio and the twisted version of events being presented by the IP, as well as the claims that led to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granting Lucio a stay of execution and remand of 4 of her successive state post-conviction claims to the trial court for further development. And good evening, Kyle.
Good evening, Lisa. How are you?
Very well. This one is another one that seems to have been snake bit. Because every time there was just some impediment to recording.
Yes, it's a busy time of year. A lot of stuff going on in the spring.
Yeah. So,
but it's good timing is the it's with the news about the stay. The media is breathless with Kim Kardashian cheers for another convicted murderer.
And in reality, Kim Kardashian has absolutely nothing to do with it. It's absolutely nothing to do with pressure, public pressure. As with Rodney Reed, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a stay based on claims raised in a successive state habeas corpus petition.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm looking at the Dallas Morning News right now, and the headline mentions the headline is actually the response of Kim Kardashian, who said it's the best news ever. And even the subhead talks about Kardashian advocating for her. So again, it's more Instagram celebrities running the justice system.
Mm-hmm. Or, well, more Instagram celebrities sticking their noses into the justice system with no clue about the facts of the case that they are advocating for.
Exactly.
And another bit of news, Rodney Reed's claim, his civil rights claim related to denial of DNA testing in state court is going to be reviewed in the U.S. Supreme Court. However, as with everything else, the media is getting it totally wrong. The U.S. Supreme Court is not going to decide whether or not he's entitled to DNA testing. The only issue being decided is whether, when you file a a federal civil rights claim, does your time to file that claim begin to run when the state court initially denies testing, or does your time begin to run after all state processes are concluded? So you are denied in state trial court, you appeal to the Court of Criminal Appeals, they deny or they affirm the trial court. And Reed actually waited 2 more years after the Court of Criminal Appeals denied or affirmed the trial court before he actually filed his civil rights claim. So they're going to decide whether the time begins immediately after the denial or whether the time begins after appeal.
Interesting.
And that is all they're going to decide.
Right.
They'll either say, nope, he waited too long, he's not entitled to pursue it, or yes, the time begins when the appeals process is over, and therefore he files his request in time. But it's a procedural issue. It's not a merits issue on
right.
on DNA testing. So,
yeah, and I think people confuse that a lot. They think because there's a procedural ruling that it automatically means it's a merit ruling.
Right. So, and we'll look at that later on. I think after, at least after the briefing in the Supreme Court case is done, we'll revisit Rodney Reed.
Sounds good.
So, all right. So we've got Mariah Alvarez, the death of Mariah Alvarez, or the murder of Mariah Alvarez. This is one of the saddest cases. I mean, they're all sad. Death is never a good thing, but this one, this child was 2 years old when her mother, who is supposed to care for her and love her and protect her, abused her to such an extent that she died alone in the middle of a floor, unattended.
It's terrible. It's heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
Those aren't even the right words.
Yeah. And Mariah was born September 6, 2004, probably in Harlingen, Texas, because that's where Lucio was living during that time period. Her father was a guy by the name of Robert Alvarez. Sometimes he's referred to as Roberto Alvarez. And her mother was Melissa Elizabeth Lucio, who's also known as Melissa Lucio, and who's also known as Melissa Salinas. Now, while I was known by my maiden name, I kept my married name after I divorced, but I haven't used my maiden name since I changed it when I got married. So,
and Salinas is her maiden name.
No, Salinas is not her maiden name. I'm not quite sure what her maiden name is, which we'll get into a little bit later. Mariah had 11 siblings: Melissa, Daniela, Alexandra, John, Robert, Richard, Renee, Selena, Gilbert, Sarah, and Adriana. I think I covered them all. Lucy also gave birth to twins in October of 2007, but I didn't count them as siblings. Mariah's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and child abuse. And she is buried in the Harlingen Combs Memorial Cemetery in an unmarked grave. In 15 years, her Melissa Lucio's family, mother, sisters, brothers, her siblings, her father, his family, nobody has seen fit to buy this child a headstone.
Yeah, as we were talking earlier, I think that screams loudly about this case, just the fact that they care so little to even buy her a headstone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They don't want to remember.
And the really the most tragic part of this case is that in September of 2004, Mariah and her Alvarez siblings, as well as two of her sisters, Lucio sisters, they were all removed from Melissa Lucio's care because of neglect, severe neglect. And so Mariah, for the first 2 years of her life, was with a foster family with whom she bonded and with whom she appears to have thrived. but she was returned November of 2006.
I know that's a hard job. I know that, I know that, the general sense is in the courts to have children with their biological parents, but this just seems like such a tragic mistake by CPS.
And well, one of the other problems is that Melissa Lucio probably could have dealt with 2 or 3 kids. She couldn't deal with 12 or 10, because I think at the time Mariah was killed, Melissa and Daniela were living outside the house, but all the other kids were living in the household. And they would live in 2-bedroom apartments that were too small.
Right.
And part of that is because of poverty, but their poverty was a result of drug use. So I don't have a lot of sympathy. I can understand if they both worked and were always working and never had any money and, couldn't pay rent and didn't get any kind of assistance, but they were doing drugs on public assistance. And that many kids, you get a lot of money from the state of Texas.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they were using it not to take care of those children, but to buy drugs. So, the perpetrator and the person who's been getting all the attention, which is disgusting, is Melissa Elizabeth Lucio, also known as Melissa Lucio, Melissa Salinas. She has 2 birth dates, apparently. Perhaps one of them belongs to Melissa Salinas. Some sources have July 18th, 1968. Others have June 18th, 1969. And she was apparently born in Lubbock, Texas. Her mother was Esperanza Correa, and I'm mispronouncing that. And her father was Santo Gonzalez, who apparently he was involved in an affair with Esperanza. And he abandoned her prior to Melissa's birth. I'm not sure what order Melissa is in. And then Esperanza had multiple live-in boyfriends. Samuel Valencia, Esquiel Kilo Carr were 2 live-in boyfriends. And then she married Algario Trevino Sr. at some point. Melissa's siblings are Sonia, Diane, I believe Renee and Richard are 2 brothers. And then there are 2 unknown siblings. Melissa dropped out in the 11th grade. At age 16, she married Guadalupe Lucio, who was 20. Now, this has led to the Innocence Project saying, oh, she was forced to be a child bride. But she chose to try to escape whatever was going on in Esperanza's home by marrying somebody.
Yeah, you see that too. That happens way too much.
And
you
that
hear that
was
frequently.
16, and her mother consented because she got her mother to consent. Now, maybe her mother should have put her foot down and said no, but she would have run away and run off and married him. I mean, Harlingen,
right.
or well, were they in? I wonder if they were in Harlingen or Lubbock. It's not clear where they were.
Yeah, and from those folks that aren't from Texas, Lubbock and Harlingen are not close.
No, Harlingen is down. People are probably more familiar with Brownsville.
You're right, but they're right there together. Yeah,
and
border
then
town.
Right across, it's a border town right across. Is it the river? Is there a river?
Well, the river is on the south side, but it's Brownsville, Harlingen. They're all right there together.
And right across from Matamoros, which
exactly
people would remember from the Santeria murders back in the 80s. So, but yeah, she made the choice to get married. She wasn't forced to be a child bride. She made the choice. She was 16 and she was being stupid. Instead of staying in school and getting out that way, she was being stupid. She also claims that her sister-in-law was manipulative and introduced her to cocaine at that time. And stupid, decided to become a drug addict. She had multiple kids born addicted to cocaine. She had kids taken away. She made a lot of bad choices and never once woke up and said, this is not working. I need to do something else. Guadalupe, her relationship with Guadalupe ended at some point, although she had probably 5 children by that time. And then she left Guadalupe and ended up in a common law relationship with Robert Alvarez. And he's the one who sired her remaining 7 children.
And does that include the twins that were born in jail?
Yes, more likely than not, that would include the twins. Now, Melissa Lucio has given conflicting claims about having been a sexual abuse victim. She has claimed to be a domestic violence victim, both with Guadalupe Lucio as well as Robert Alvarez. Although I think her claims about Robert Alvarez have been conflicting, where she's made claims, but people have said they never saw Alvarez actually, abuse her in any way. She's addicted to drugs, used drugs, abused drugs. She suffered from depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Her family was the subject of multiple CPS investigations for neglect and neglectful supervision between December 21st, 1995 and February 17th, 2007. And that was investigations in 1995, 1996, 1998, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, and 2004, when the kids were ultimately taken away.
Yeah, you have to ask, mentioned it earlier, how can there be that many investigations and it takes, what is that, the 5th or 6th?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, the 7th time to finally be taken away.
Yeah. And it's, like I said, it's really sad that there was that much involvement with CPS. Something the Innocence Project has claimed, which I don't put any stock in whatsoever. Innocence Project claims because the CPS records, the children don't claim Lucio abused them, therefore she didn't abuse Mariah. And I don't find any credence or any credibility to that, because kids very rarely point the finger at mom or dad when they are being abused and when CPS is investigating. And usually they are well trained enough that they give whatever lies mom and dad have told them to tell. That CPS doesn't believe that and, removes them or whatever occurs, but generally kids don't point the finger at mom or dad.
Right. Well, and it seems like too, the system, being in foster care has a really negative reputation. Some of it probably fair, some by unfair, but I'm sure a lot of kids feel like, well, this may suck, but at least it sucks with my family better than going and sucking with a bunch of strangers.
No, and actually I think a lot of abused kids, they still, first of all, they're conditioned to think it's their fault.
Of course.
And
yeah,
so
absolutely.
they think, that when they're taken away, that's even worse. I knew a family that had issues, and when the child was taken away, the child lied about the foster parents to get them in trouble, thinking that would get her back home.
That would get her back home, right?
And it just got her to another foster family. And sometimes foster families are not good. There are a lot of foster parents who abuse their charges and who abuse the system. But that is, again, there is a documented case of abuse, though, by Lucio against her son, Gabriel, who also tested positive for cocaine at the time of his birth in around November of 2000. Mariah tested positive cocaine. In fact, in September of 2004, when she went to her foster family, she went through withdrawal with the foster family. So, the argument that Lucio never abused Mariah is made out of whole cloth. It's very carefully crafted to, sound good, but it isn't true. Because I would think if you're pregnant and you're doing cocaine and then your child is born addicted to it, you have abused your child.
Absolutely.
You may not have physically laid hands on the kid, but you have abused the child by ingesting a drug that passes through to the baby, and then the baby is born addicted, which can cause a myriad of health and other problems for an infant. And then also in September of 2006, Lucio was arrested for a misdemeanor DWI, but she used the alias Melissa Salinas. So she apparently had a driver's license and everything under the name Melissa Salinas. And, an interesting thing in State versus Melissa Lucio, not once did they mention Melissa Salinas. Not once did they mention that DWI. And if you read some of the articles on the internet, it's like the DWI and the jail records that were used at the punishment phase of her trial, like they were all made up. Everybody's out to get Melissa Lucio. Everybody hates her. Nobody loves her. Everybody hates her. Guess she should eat some worms. Because it's like a big conspiracy,
Well, we've seen that a lot of these Innocence Project cases, right? It's the folks that believe they're innocent. There's a massive coordinated conspiracy against some poor person.
Yeah. So, and I think that's the thing with Melissa Lucio that people don't understand. This is a woman who is never going to take responsibility for anything. If you see her smack somebody in the face, she will deny to her dying breath that she did it. She'll say they fell into her hand. She'll say that they ran into her hand. She'll say she wasn't even there. It couldn't have happened.
Right.
She'll never take accountability. She never has, she never will. And if she can find excuses, she will make them up. And of course, again, as we know, her victim was her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah Alvarez. So, the crime occurred in Harlingen, Texas, Cameron County. Mariah was born to Lucio and Robert Alvarez on September 6, 2004. She was the 7th child to Lucio and Alvarez and the 12th child for Lucio. Lucio was 35 at the time Mariah was born. Her first marriage at age 16 to Guadalupe, Lucio produced 5 children before they were divorced. While Lucio claims to have had a long history of sexual abuse and domestic violence throughout her life, including during her marriage to Lucio, she's also denied it. So it's kind of, I kind of wonder how much of it is used to get sympathy.
Right.
Maybe, you know, maybe it's not well documented. That's for sure. I don't like saying it's definitely not true. I don't know.
Well, I'm with you. Like, I would never want to question somebody's claim, of that, but I also don't think it's unfair to say that we've definitely seen instances of people who get in trouble or who are looking for attention or sympathy claiming to have suffered,
Right.
particular crimes, a lot of times abuse, because that's
And
sort of, they feel like it gives them well, okay, everything else, you get a pass on.
yeah. And I think I read multiple pleadings put together by Lucio's advocates, and the accounts have changed. The people who abused her or sexually abused her, it's changed. And it's, it started earlier, it started later. And in the state versus Melissa Lucio, the only person she mentioned was her mother's boyfriend, Carr, I believe. And yet in later things, it's, 2 or 3 different people, some relatives, some uncles, some boyfriends, some cousins, some strangers. So I don't know whether she's exaggerating or whether it, it all really happened. And I don't want to say it didn't. Lucio was raised by a single mother, at least for a time. She had 2 sisters, Sonia and Diane. She has 4 other siblings, including 2 brothers, Richard and Renee, and 2 other siblings that I don't know their names. She claims a live-in boyfriend of her mother's began sexually abusing her at age 7, and some things it's age 6. In September of 2004, Mariah and her Alvarez siblings and the minor Lucio siblings were removed from the household due to evidence of severe neglect. CPS workers observed ants crawling on Mariah's mattress, and they found little food in the house, which was dirty and smelled of urine. The children were also dirty and had strong body odor. Each child exhibited minor injuries consistent with abuse. Robert had staples on his head, allegedly due to a fall off a bed, and Gabriel had bite marks. We talked about Lucio's history with CPS. And another thing that I found, the kids were all aggressive and violent with each other, with other people. This was a problem with like all of the kids, and they're learning that not just from their father or not just from the man in the house. They've got to be learning that because the girls are doing it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's got to be learned behavior, and there's probably some sort of Lord of the Flies, just survival tactics, given the lack of food, lack of care. A lot of it is likely learned, but some of it may just be trying to survive.
And cocaine is such a stimulant that when you're high on cocaine,
Yes.
you can turn on the drop of a hat.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can be fine, and then all of a sudden you're not, and you're yelling and screaming and ready to, beat the crap out of whoever gets in your way. And that is what they grew up with. That's what they saw in their house. Lucio and the family have claimed that on February 15th, 2007, Mariah fell down a steep staircase at their old apartment in Harlingen. The statements, however, given by Lucio and her children regarding the event are confusing and contradictory. Some kids say they saw it in one statement, and then in another statement, they say Lucio told them about it. They don't give consistent statements about who was present when it happened. Some of them say Mariah fell down 2 or 3 stairs. Some even said the fall happened at their new apartment, which only had 2 or 3 stairs right at the front door. So whether a significant fall happened is questionable. Another problem is that if the fall was as bad as Lucio claims it was, and the injuries Mariah suffered were that bad, Mariah was not taken to a doctor or a hospital to be seen by a doctor. And this is in spite of the fact that she was lethargic, vomiting, refusing to eat. Her jaw was locking up, which could be seizure, and she was having trouble breathing. Lucio admitted to police that she feared taking Mariah to a doctor because of the numerous bruises in various stages of healing all over Mariah's body. And this child was bruised head to toe. And it wasn't just arms and legs like a, clumsy kid, because they've tried to say, oh, Mariah fell a lot. This was her genitals had bruises because Lucio admitted to pinching them. She had bruises on her chest. She had internal bruising on her kidneys, spine, and lung. So this was not a clumsy kid, bruises on a clumsy kid being mistaken for child abuse.
Exactly.
Like I said, one of the detectives in Lucio's interview said the child was bruised head to toe. And I believe him. And another part of their interview, they're taking pictures. Well, how did she get this bruise? Did you hit her on the chest? And Lucio would deny it. So at around 7:00 p.m. on February 17, 2007, paramedics were summoned to Lucio's new apartment for Mariah, who was lying alone in the middle of the floor, unresponsive, not breathing, and with no heartbeat. One EMT observed that Lucio showed little interest in Mariah and was not holding her when they arrived. The lack of concern made an impression on the EMTs. I think another flaw in CPS's return of the children is that they took Mariah away at the age of 3 weeks. She did not bond with Lucio, and Lucio did not bond with her, although I doubt Lucio would have bonded with her anyway. I don't think Lucio bonded to any of her children. They were just a means to an end to her.
Right. And you'll probably get to this, but what was the time of death that they believe?
Well, she was pronounced at the hospital. So the time of death is going to be
right. So it'll be after they picked her up, but she was unresponsive when they got there. So
she was unresponsive, not breathing, with no heartbeat. I think they were able to resuscitate her. They were able to resuscitate her, and they brought her to the hospital, but she was declared, and I think she was finally declared dead at like 8 or 9 o'clock.
Got it.
So they may have thought they could resuscitate her, and she was beyond help. But it was 8 or 9 o'clock, and that's another thing that puts this in context. The reason Lucio and Alvarez were questioned so late at night was because all of this took place late at night. They didn't take them to the police station until 10 o'clock. So they left them at the hospital with the kids dealing with the death of Mariah. The claims that she was questioned late at night, not allowed to sleep, not given any food, that's all bullshit. That's something made up by one of her appellate attorneys that was shot down very quickly in her post-conviction claims. The ER physician one of the ER physicians who treated Mariah stated that her injuries were the absolute worst case of abuse he'd seen in his 30 years of practice. And again, there was a time lapse because after Mariah died, there was apparently an effort made to document the extensive bruising on her body prior to questioning Lucio and Alvarez. And they weren't just questioning Lucio. They weren't focusing on Lucio. They were questioning Alvarez as well. So the questioning began about 10 p.m. Also, during their investigation of Mariah's death, they found paraphernalia used to smoke crack cocaine in the apartment. Lucio denied using drugs again, and I think her drug tests were clear, but Alvarez had started again. And Lucio was probably not far behind. During initial questioning, Lucio insisted that Mariah's death was the result of her fall on 2/15/2007. The array of bruises on Mariah's body and several injuries, including a bite mark on her back and shoulder, were indicative of long-term child abuse. It was also discovered that Mariah had sustained a broken arm at least 2 weeks before her death, which had remained untreated. The estimate of the break was 2 to 7 weeks. But even 2 weeks with a broken bone without medical treatment is torture. So,
yeah, it's terrible.
I mean, 2 weeks, she had a broken arm. At least 2 weeks. Initially, Lucio claimed that most of Mariah's injuries were the result of rough play by her siblings, mosquito bites, and temper tantrums. After 5 hours, Lucio admitted to causing most of Mariah's injuries and admitted to abusing the child. However, she always denied striking Mariah in the head. In a phone call to her sister, Lucio said, "Don't blame Robert. This was me. I did it, so don't blame Robert," which her sister then denied that that's what they were talking about. Her family has also enabled her to a degree. When she spent her assistance money on drugs and couldn't pay her rent, her family would give her money to pay her rent. So, and they're continuing to enable her now. In her statement to police, Lucio admitted that she would hit Mariah when she got mad. She admitted to taking her frustration out with the other children, jumping around by biting Mariah on the back while she brushed Mariah's hair. And I think that was another factor, is that if Mariah was there, as you said when you and I initially discussed looking at this case, as Selena has said on her TikTok videos, Mariah became Lucio's whipping boy.
Right. And that's pretty common, right? I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but it's not uncommon for an abusive parent to pick one, if he or she has multiple children, to pick one to sort of be the brunt of the abuse.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've heard it called like the Cinderella syndrome or something, where they pick one child to sort of take everything out on.
Yeah.
So, just because, another child, one of the other 11 children weren't abused doesn't mean that Mariah was not.
Correct. And, I think another thing too is that sometimes it is gender-based. All the girls will be mistreated, but the boys will not. And the boys will be allowed to mistreat the girls.
Well, and I think you really said it well, which I thought was insightful. Mariah was taken away when she was an infant. And so Lucio never really may have bonded with her, and may have, never, even though, she was her physical daughter, may have felt differently about her.
And, and I acknowledge they don't call it terrible twos for nothing. Mariah was 2 years old when she was returned, and she probably was not happy to be in this new situation. She didn't understand.
Right.
And so she probably was going to act out to a degree that probably would have set Lucio off. But again, what Selena has said is that Mariah became very withdrawn and very quiet around her mother. So it's like she may have initially been thrown a tantrum or been resistant to Melissa Lucio, but she learned that she needed to be quiet and just not be seen. So during questioning, Lucio did not try to blame Mariah's abuse on any of her other children. Now, she said rough play, but she never claimed that the other children abused Mariah. Nor did she claim that Alexandra, one of her older daughters by Guadalupe Lucio, abused Mariah. In interviews during the investigation, none of the children claimed to have seen Alexandra cause Mariah's fall or abuse Mariah. Lucio stated that only she spanked Mariah or hit Mariah, and she stated several times that neither Alvarez nor any of the other children hit Mariah. This comes into play later. We'll keep score. During questioning with police, Alvarez stated that Mariah had head pain and he observed bruises on her chest. He says that Lucio told him the bruises came from play with Mariah's siblings. The children told him Lucio hit Mariah. He observed bruises on Mariah's cheeks and said that Mariah was afraid of her mother. On February 19, 2007, Dr. Norma Farley conducted Mariah's autopsy. She attributed Mariah's death to blunt force head trauma and opined that the injury would have caused immediate distress, making it unlikely that it could have been sustained more than 24 hours before Mariah's death. In addition to the array of external bruising on Mariah's body, Dr. Farley documented internal bruising on Mariah's spine, kidneys, and lung. Mariah was also noted to be severely dehydrated and malnourished at the time of her death. And the picture that I posted is probably her second birthday with her foster family on September 6th, 2006. And that is the last picture taken of that child. And there probably aren't a lot of other pictures. When you do a search for Mariah Alvarez, that's the only picture you find of Mariah, and the rest are all Lucio. So now this, like I said, this case was investigated by Harlingen PD, and they brought in Texas Rangers, probably because they lacked some resources if the case expanded outside of Harlingen and Cameron County.
Right.
Something interesting, there's a lot of stuff, people claiming racism because Lucio's Hispanic. But I made a list of the names of the police detectives. We have Ranger Miguel Ramirez, Ranger Castaneda, Ranger Escalon, Detective Cruz, Officer Villarreal, Detective Jesus Banda, Detective Salinas, no relation to Melissa, Detective Martinez, and Investigator Joe Lopez. So that's a lot of Hispanic names.
Right. Well, and as the prosecutor too, I believe, right? I think there's,
right.
And, I can tell you, I have several friends that live in the Valley, and while they will tell you it has its own interesting culture that is neither Texan or Mexican, it's kind of its own different place.
Right.
It is definitely a, strongly Hispanic, culture. It's right there on the border. So yeah, it's claims of racism are just kind of silly. It's just like, oh yeah, we've got to throw the racism card against the door because, well, that's what we always do.
Let's see if it sticks. Yeah. And, like the doctors, there was one of the emergency room doctors was Dr. Vargas. The other was Dr. Davis, and he came in years later claiming Vargas didn't know what he was talking about, but that's typical of IP witnesses. The judge was Arturo Cisneros Nelson. And I've met some Hispanic people with Irish names and very Anglo-sounding names. So, but I mean, with a name like Arturo, he's at least half Spanish or half Hispanic. The experts were Pinkerman and Villanueva. Now, something, I guess we'll knock it out the park right now. Her prosecutors were Alfredo Padilla and Maria DeFord. While the prosecutor in Cameron County, the overall DA, was involved in some scandal between 2005 and 2007, that was not involved in Lucio's case. And Lucio's never presented any evidence that he did anything or had any influence on her case. He was the DA in name, but it doesn't look like he put hands on Lucio's case. And he was basically taking money to basically for discretionary decisions like charging. If you paid him, he would charge you with a misdemeanor instead of a felony. Which is wrong. I'm not saying it's not wrong, but that wasn't involved in her case. And he actually let a murderer, he was trying to jockey to get a $500,000 bond to two of his partners for the family members of a murdered woman from the killer. And so he got the judge and the attorneys involved. He took a kickback. They did get the $500,000, which earned them $200,000 in attorney's fees. The $300,000 went to the victim's family. So, they were pursuing a civil claim. But the problem is that he and the judge agreed to let the killer, after he pled guilty, leave the courthouse to get his affairs in order. And he was an Indian national. And so he went back to India.
So it wasn't like he was overcharging people. He was actually undercharging people. Potentially.
He could have been undercharging. So, and again, I mean, Lucio has never said, Villalobos came to me and said, if I paid him $100,000, he would charge me with injury to a child. And I couldn't, so he charged me with capital murder. And she's not saying that. So what he was doing while it was wrong, I don't think it had any bearing on this case or the prosecution of Melissa Lucio.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's possible for a prosecutor to be a scumbag and doing things wrong, stealing money, but doesn't necessarily mean he's, corrupt on a particular case.
Right. And again, it doesn't appear that he actually laid any hand on this case. Now, something to clear up. Melissa Lucio was charged with capital murder because Mariah was a child under age 6. And Lucio caused her death. Alvarez was also charged with injury to a child by omission. On the same date of her indictment, and I don't know how this worked, she entered a guilty plea to misdemeanor DWI, waived jury, waived counsel, and waived appeal. And apparently Alvarez must have been let go because he was in the wind for a while and then arrested in August of 2008. Don't know how that happened. There are gaps in the chronology for his case. So the case was the 138th Judicial District, Cameron County, Texas. Lucio was represented by Peter C. Gilman and Adolfo Cordova. They did have some hearings. They had a hearings multiple hearings, I think, regarding obtaining CPS records. And they also had a hearing regarding the admissibility of Lucio's statement to police. So from the beginning, Gilman was trying to keep that statement out. And there was a motion to determine the voluntariness of the statement, which unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand. When you try to claim a statement isn't voluntary, you have to have some actions on the part of the police officers that would render it involuntary. They physically strike you.
Right.
They, leave you in a room for 6 hours, deny letting you use the bathroom, deny food, deny water, saying, I want to talk to an attorney and having them ignore that and just keep questioning you. You have to have something like that. You can't just say, I was in a police station. That's inherently coercive. Therefore, my statement wasn't voluntary. It's not how it works. There has to be something done by police to overbear your, free will.
And I mean, I get it happens, and I realize like the Innocence Project in Spanish means this confession was coerced. But I really have a hard time believing a mother would falsely confess to killing her children. Not going to say it doesn't happen, but that's a tough pill for me to swallow.
And that's another thing that the Innocence Project ignores. She didn't confess to killing Mariah. She confessed to abusing Mariah, but she always denied
actually killing
the
her.
injuries that caused her death. She always claimed those injuries were sustained in the fall. She never said I killed her. She admitted to abusing her, and it's kind of it's a reasonable inference that if you abused her to cause that many injuries, including kidney, lung, spine, then it's not a far trip to think you could have caused injury, blunt trauma to the head. And that could be shaken baby. You didn't have to hit her or knock her head against something. You could have shaken her and not even realized that you caused an injury. So the state was represented by, like I said, Alfredo Padilla and Maria DeFord. And throughout the paperwork, those are the only names that appear on behalf of the people of Cameron County or the state of Texas. The guilt innocence phase of Lucio's trial was June 30th, 2008 through July 8th, 2008. Her defenses were that Mariah's cause of death was from the fall, that Lucio did not cause any of the fatal injuries, that Lucio's statement to police was not true, and they made an unsuccessful effort to have their expert psychologist and social worker testify regarding false confession or regarding Lucio's propensity to admit to a crime she didn't commit because she was a battered woman. On July 8th, 2008, they found Melissa Lucio guilty. And once again, her jury foreperson was Melissa Quintanilla. The penalty phase was July 9th, 2008 through July 10th, 2008. There was the DWI guilty plea, which was entered in May of 2007. And then jail records. While in jail, waiting trial, Lucio got into fights, was written up for disrespecting correction officers, was written up for possession of contraband, and unauthorized communication. Among other things, there are a few other things that were in there, but I didn't write them down. So she's not exactly a rule follower.
Right. Yeah.
As
she's
evidenced
not
by a second identity with a second birth date.
Well, and it's kind of interesting too. And again, I no comment on whether or not she was abused, but I mean, even in prison, she doesn't exhibit the meek, abused personality. She's already getting into fights. She's causing problems with the guards. You know, she seems to be just, you know, a
Right.
person who trouble follows her.
Right. And of course, on July 10th, 2008, the jury rendered its verdict. They answered yes to the future dangerousness question, and they found no to whether the mitigating evidence outweighed the aggravators, and they sentenced Lucio to death. After the verdict, the attorney, prior to formal sentencing, moved that Lucio be sentenced to life without parole in light of Berry versus State, which is essentially asking the judge to disregard the jury sentence and sentence Lucio to a lesser penalty, which a judge in a criminal case cannot do. And I think the U.S. Supreme Court would frown on a judge that did. But Berry involved a woman who killed a newborn and then years later abandoned a second one, who I think was just severely injured. She survived. And there was a lot of they were isolated incidents. She had other kids that she was loving and cared for very well. She apparently was having children with this person, and she didn't like those children and didn't want those children because her children by this other person were fine. It's really strange, but the jury had sentenced her to death, and the Court of Criminal Appeals found that she wasn't a danger. The future dangerous wasn't supported by the evidence for her jury, because those incidents with the children with the babies newborns were isolated. On July 22nd, 2008, Lucio was sentenced to death with a credit for 521 days. And that's done so that if the sentence is vacated and she's sentenced to life without parole, that's done so that there's a credit for whatever days she served pending trial. In Alvarez's case, he was found guilty on September 21st, 2009 of injury to a child, and he was sentenced to serve 4 years. Now, something I think they mentioned in State versus Lucio, he only served 4 years and how unfair that was. But he did not lay hands on Mariah. He was guilty of injury to a child by omission. Right. So he knew she was hurt and he didn't get help. That was his crime. That's why he was only sentenced to 4 years.
Well, and it's good to remind everybody earlier on the phone call, she's recorded saying, you know, don't blame Robert.
Yeah, don't blame him. He didn't do anything. Yeah. Right. And she denied that he did anything to the police. So, you know, of course, he's not going to be charged with capital murder either. But they're arguing like he's a man, so he gets a lesser charge than I do because I'm a woman. But no, you got the charge you got because you inflicted the injuries.
Well, and that's one of those things. That's one of the talking points now about how, you know, unfair their criminal justice system is, you know, based on physical characteristics. And, you know, if there's anything that's really non-controversial is that on average, women receive exponentially lower sentences for commensurate crimes than men do, you know, so
yeah,
it's really a pretty weak sauce.
Yeah. So, direct appeal, her attorney was Larry Warner. He was from Harlingen. He was appointed by the court on December 10th, 2008. Her conviction and sentence were both affirmed on September 14th, 2011. which happens to be my birthday. Basically, the court, Lucio raised 14 points of error, and most of them involved the future dangerousness. She wanted to go back and have a hearing to have the court determine whether or not her proof had failed. She was challenging the DWI guilty verdict and the process that was obtained in. She wanted them to find the evidence was legally insufficient under Barry. Instead of going through each one, I'm just going to try and summarize. She argued that the evidence was legally and factually insufficient to support her conviction and her sentence. And she also complained about the trial court refusing to allow Villanueva and Pinkerman to testify about Lucio's confession. And essentially what they wanted to do was they wanted to put Villanueva on and Pinkerman on to say the confession wasn't true, or the confession wasn't voluntary because she was a battered woman. And whether the confession is voluntary or not, initially that's made by a judge, but it's also an issue a jury decides.
Right.
And it's also up to the jury to decide if the confession is true or not.
Well, and the thing is too, is, she may have been a battered woman, but being a battered woman doesn't make you confess to killing your children.
Mm-hmm. Correct. And it's also, she may have been a battered woman, and they were saying because she was a battered woman, her way of interacting with the police investigators interviewing her was consistent with a battered woman, and where she's just going to agree with whatever they tell her, or she's going to take the blame for everything.
Well, I think it's a good thing maybe to tease out for a second. So I've, in reading some of the folks that believe she's innocent, that they say, oh, well, the kids never said that she was abused. Did she ever file charges or make a complaint or restraining order against anybody that battered her?
No.
So yeah, you can't, it can't be both ways, right? You can't believe, well, she was scared, so she would never have turned in her partner who may have abused her. Okay, that's fine. If you argue that, fair enough. But then you can't turn around and say, oh, well, the kids didn't say that she abused them, so she clearly didn't. It has to work both ways. If the victim is scared to report it, fair, that's absolutely fair. But then it has to be both victims, both the kids and her.
Yeah.
You can't switch your point of view, depending on who it is.
And I take issue with them claiming that the CPS records don't show abuse, because there is an instance of abuse documented with Gabriel.
Absolutely. Well, and Mariah too, right? She was taken away from her.
So, well, the 2004, the kids were taken away because of the condition in the house.
Right. Fair enough.
And the absence of food and the filth in the house, and the fact that the kids were not being cared for.
Well, and that stuff is not always related, but a lot of times those things are related.
So, and then another kind of interesting facet is that after the twins were born, CPS was trying to decide whether or not to terminate Lucio's rights with all of her kids, and whether or not to allow those children to visit her in jail. So they had a therapist come in and offer therapy to Lucio while in jail. And one of the things that became an issue was that the prosecution was able to get the therapy notes. Of course, the defense also got those notes. And there were some inconsistencies in the notes that were eventually used to impeach Lucio's experts. Because this is another problem with the mitigation experts, is sometimes they look at the they tend to, how can I put this? They tend to look at the records with rose-colored glasses. They look for what supports whatever their position is, nonviolent, candidate for sainthood, whatever, and they ignore and close their eyes to anything that's not.
Right.
And one of the things in the records was that Lucio denied to the therapist that she had ever been sexually abused. So when the mitigation person is on the stand in the punishment phase talking about all this sexual abuse, then, well, she said she wasn't sexually abused in these records. Does that change your opinion? And that doesn't look good. And the therapist had those records and had those notes. So, you know, she should have seen that little problem to say, you told this guy you weren't abused. Why would you tell him that if you were abused?
Right.
So they overruled most, or they actually overruled all of her complaints, and I'm not gonna detail them. But most of the things I can say, most of the things that they're raising now were raised in her direct appeal. So they're not new, because they've presented it to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals that did not find it had merit. So there were 2 concurrences with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals by Judge Keller and Judge Cochran. She did file a writ with the United States Supreme Court, which was denied on June 4th, 2012. So her conviction and sentence became final on June 4th, 2012. She did pursue a state post-conviction claim with the DWI on the grounds that her waiver of the jury counsel and appeal were not voluntary or knowing. However, there was a hearing, and Lucio appeared and testified at that hearing. And in her testimony, she admitted that she pled guilty to DWI because she was guilty of DWI. Wah, wah, wah. That pretty much tanks her whole case.
Why, just for the audience out there, why would this seems odd to me that she's even thinking about her TWI at this point? Can you provide a little color as to why she may have done this?
I think what happened was, first of all, she was arrested under an assumed name.
Melissa Salinas, right?
The Melissa Salinas. And so I think that after the capital murder charge, this DWI began to heat up, and there was fingerprint evidence and, you know, evidence that would look really bad for her if it came into the capital murder case.
Got it. Because it just kind of shows that she's lying, has a history of lying all the way to having a complete fake identity.
Right. And that plus that she was arrested under this fake identity, and it proves to be her. So I think initially the strategy was just plead guilty. It's a misdemeanor. Get it out of the way. We'll try and find some way to keep it out of the trial. And then when she gets another attorney, he's like, well, let's see if we can get rid of it by claiming your waiver was not voluntary and knowing. And if we get rid of it, we get rid of half the future dangerousness finding. And so we can get the death sentence reversed. And I think this is the thought process. But then Lucio who, bless her heart, isn't smart, gets up there and says, well, no, I pled guilty to DWI because I was guilty of DWI. And I think that's the only time in her life she's admitted when she's done something wrong. But it bit her in the ass. So, the court affirmed, and this was done, the county court at law, and then it was appealed to the 13th District Court of Appeal. They didn't even try to take it to the Court of Criminal Appeals. And you can, again, another thing for people that are out there listening that are shocked, you don't have to have an attorney. You can waive an attorney. You can waive a jury. You can waive appeal, as long as you do it knowing and voluntary. You know, just like when you get a ticket, a traffic ticket, a moving violation, or a speeding ticket, when you go, you plead no contest, you're doing it without an attorney telling you. And you're waiving appeal. And, you know, you're hoping that the judge doesn't give you a fine you can't pay. And, you know, that's not uncommon. And one of the arguments they tried to make was that her Sixth Amendment right to an attorney in the capital murder extended to the DWI, which isn't true. They're separate. And the same for the therapist, because he wasn't working for police. Her Sixth Amendment right did not attach to the therapy. So she has filed multiple writs. There was apparently a writ filed in 2009 while she was pursuing her direct appeal. It was denied in October of 2009. She filed a second writ, which I think is the state post-conviction writ that went through the process. It was decided on July 23rd, 2012 by the trial court. And again, I'm not going to go into each and every one of the allegations. She made a lot of allegations for ineffective assistance of counsel. And again, most of the claims that she raised in her first post-conviction claim are ones that are being repackaged by the Innocence Project now. And I think we can revisit this case when the remanded case has worked its way through the system, and we'll talk about these issues in detail then.
That makes sense.
Because I think it'd be better spent to compare what she claims now with what she claimed then. They found, you know, most of the issues didn't have any merit. The contractor, she didn't have a Sixth Amendment right. He didn't have to Mirandize her. He wasn't working for police. And you know, his notes were not improperly admitted. The experts that were hired by her attorney were, you know, not deficient, and the attorney was not deficient for hiring them. Of course, now Innocence Project brings in experts who are going to say Dr. Farley was lying. And that's the thing that angers me so much, is that they come in and they impugn the character of the original experts for either the state or the convicted person. And they say they were lying when it's a difference of opinion. And a difference of opinion is not a lie.
Right.
You know, I don't agree with Dr. Bodden, but I'm not saying he's lying. You know, I think he's he's looking at a very limited sphere of information to come to his conclusion, because that's a conclusion he needs to come to. I think if he were the medical examiner in the case with Stacy just having been murdered, he would have come to different conclusions. So. And
yeah, if you have a sec, one, again, back to things I've seen, that's in some of the popular press. Maybe talk a minute about the claims of a Brady violation, because I think that's the big scary one that's easy to distract folks that believe that she was innocent. What's the quick summary of the Brady claims?
The Brady claims, I think, deal with CPS records and records from a place called Maggie's house, which I guess is where juvenile minors are taken for interviews when a crime occurs, when they witness a crime, when they're a victim of a crime. And so Lucio's kids were taken to Maggie's house and interviewed by social workers at Maggie's house. And interviewing kids is tricky. You have to be careful. You have to ask them. You have to be very careful. You don't ask them yes or no questions. You don't lead them. You try to ask them open-ended questions and hope to draw out information from them. So they went to the state does not generate those records, does not have those records. They have to get those records from another department. And there was apparently a delay in producing the CPS records. The CPS records are also confidential. So there was probably a whole lot of wrangling among the state, the defense, and the judge with CPS. And I think CPS is a little overwhelmed, especially in that area, given the proximity to the border.
Absolutely.
And so CPS delayed providing records to the state to then be turned over to the defense. So there's an argument that the defense would have made better use of those records, and they would have found that the kids never accused Lucio of violence if they'd had the records, and they must not have had the records. That's not true. They had the records. Her attorney said he was ready to go, and he went to trial and he used the records. Problem is, there's some things that were in those records that came back and were used to good effect by the state in cross-examination. So that is one of the Brady violations, and it's been made before, and Lucio failed to prove it then. I don't think she's going to prove it now, although I have seen them claim that an attorney who got her habeas attorney's records and he got them from Gilman, that the records aren't in, or pages from those records are not in the files they got. But to prove the Brady violation, they're going to have Gilman come in, or Cordova, her second chair, come in and say, yep, didn't have those records. And guess what? They're not going to do that. Because if they were going to do that, they would have done that already.
Absolutely.
And then the Maggie's house, there was a question of whether or not the Maggie's house records were discoverable and whether they had any Brady material in them. The judge determined that they did not, and so they weren't produced as a result of the judge finding there was no Brady potentially exculpatory material. And then later on, they were produced.
Because really the only thing, I'm just kind of riffing, but the only thing that would have been exculpatory, right, would have been if one of the children would have said they witnessed somebody else kill Mariah,
Well,
right? I
I
mean, even if
think
the children said, "Oh, I did not see mom ever beat Mariah," that's not necessarily exculpatory.
right. And you know, the problem with that too is that while some of the kids said I never saw bruises on Mariah, and I think what they're talking about is the kids saying we didn't see bruises on Mariah. Well, maybe they didn't want to see bruises on Mariah.
But that's indisputable,
You know,
right? I mean, we have evidence of bruises on
there's
Mariah,
evidence of
right?
right, exactly.
That's not even an open question.
Yeah. And let me look at this. I'm going to look specifically because they did raise this Brady violation. The CPS records were produced before trial, and any delay was due to the failure of CPS to timely provide the records. Lucio failed to demonstrate harm as a result of late disclosure of CPS records. And then the same with Maggie's house. So those are the Brady violations they were alleging. I think that they are alleging a Brady violation because they've got subsequent attorneys who are saying some pages of the records aren't in the council's files. But even that doesn't necessarily mean that council didn't have them. That just means that sometime between the time council had the file and you got the file, something is misplaced or lost or whatever. You know, like I said, to prove a Brady violation, they're going to have to bring Gilman or the second chair attorney, Cordova, in to say, I'd never seen this report before. It wasn't in my files. I didn't have it. If I'd had it, I would have used it. But even with a Brady violation, you have to prove the materiality of the evidence. It would have to be somebody saying, I saw Alexandra
Yep, exactly.
push
Somebody else to do it.
Mariah down the stairs and laugh when she hit the ground at the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, again, in a lot of these cases, you could have, oh yes, I never, yeah, I never saw Lee Harvey Oswald shoot a president before, so he must be innocent of killing President Kennedy,
right. And for, like I said, for that, the kids' statements, some of the material in the CPS records was helpful, but some of it was not. Whereas the kids said she loved Mariah, they also said she was afraid of her. And there was a thing where Richard and Renee apparently gave affidavits that said they saw Alexandra with her and knock her down the stairs. But then in the CPS records, they said they gave inconsistent statements about the fall itself. They said it was a fall at their new apartment.
Well, and part of it is I call it out because I feel like the Brady violation, quote unquote, is one of those headline grabbers that folks that listen to true crime podcasts, oh my gosh, that means that the state found evidence of somebody else's blood on Mariah. There's a fingerprint, oh, this is big, scary, exculpatory evidence, which it doesn't necessarily mean that making a Brady claim means that there is very clear exculpatory evidence out there that the prosecution hid from the defense.
Yeah. And, Richard and Renee, in their statements to CPS or in their Maggie's House interviews, they gave statements that would have been detrimental to Lucio, including that violence was a regular occurrence in the household and that Lucio was the aggressor.
Yeah. Well, and even, I think we talked about it earlier. Even one or several of her kids, I forget which one of the 14 has, even publicly been pretty vocal that her mom did really take out, specifically targeted Mariah and, beat her frequently.
Yeah, that was Selena.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, that's Selena. And then, they found counsel was not deficient for failing to place blame on Alexandra. The evidence submitted in support of the allegation was an unsworn hearsay affidavit reporting hearsay from 3 sources and did not rise to the level of credible evidence. That was what they talked about in the documentary. And I'm making air quotes as I say that, that the Villanueva, the kids told her Alexandra pushed Mariah down the stairs. But again, the Brady violation, it's not just that they withheld it, and you have to prove they withheld it. So CPS records, if that was because of delay in CPS producing the records, it's not the state.
Exactly.
Now they're going to argue the CPS is an agency of the state, but that doesn't work. You can simplify it to that if you want to, but that's playing to the court of public opinion.
Exactly. Well, and I mean,
it's not going to play in court.
Right. And I hate to stereotype, but I mean, my gut would be if you interviewed 100 CPS workers, 99 of them are going to be more of your kind of bleeding hearts. She's probably didn't do it. We really, have a lot of sympathy. They're not exactly hardcore law and order prosecutors, generally speaking.
Yeah. And but again, the other thing is it's not just that evidence was withheld. That evidence has to be material, and they have to prove that it would have changed the outcome of the trial. And on the allegations they presented before in prior actions, those have not been ones that would have changed the outcome of the trial, because there is contradictory information sometimes within the records that they're citing as supportive. And I would imagine in the CPS records, there's, information that is detrimental to Lucio contained within the same records. So, but again, the Innocence Project tends to put blinders on. And then they only look at what they want to look at, and they ignore anything that doesn't fit.
Exactly.
And I find that more and more with their work. I mean, they're involved in Melissa Lucio. There's no DNA. There's no physical evidence. There never was. There never will be. So there's nothing that can conclusively, definitively prove her guilt or innocence.
Right. Well, we've talked about this before. I mean, the Innocence Project uses these poor people, and they do some good. Absolutely. Nobody would argue that no one wants to see an innocent person convicted, but the Innocence Project abuses and takes advantage of these defendants because how they can package them and sell them to the Twitterverse and get somebody like a Kim Kardashian to help raise money for the Innocence Project. And she fits the profile. She's a woman. She's a person of color. She's from evil
she
Texas.
Is not. She actually is not. She is Armenian. She is European.
Okay, my mind is blown.
Eastern European.
Okay, you have blown my mind. I knew you could blow my mind, but okay, you have absolutely blown my mind. That's fantastic. She is Armenian.
Okay, yeah, because Turkey is Europe.
Okay, to be honest,
Greece is Europe.
I apologize. Please do not cancel me. I assumed she was Hispanic.
Nope. Now, I don't know about Chris, but Kardashian's Armenian.
Oh, no, Kardashian is. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I meant about Lucio. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No.
Oh,
okay.
no, I was
thought
saying,
you were saying Kim
no,
Kardashian.
Kardashian. Oh, yeah, I knew she was Armenian.
No, I'm sorry.
No. I was like, I'm about to be canceled. You're gonna have to fire me
No,
because
you're right.
just
No. And that was my mistake. I thought you were talking about Kardashian.
No, yeah, but I just,
Saying,
she's a woman, she's a person of color,
yeah,
she
she
can get the
is.
Twitter mob outraged
And
over her execution.
I
Because,
think,
we went through this, I remember, I don't remember, was it 2000? Oh gosh, when was it? Late 90s. Here in Texas, we went through this with Carla Faye Tucker, who
yeah,
was there had not been a woman executed by Texas in a really long time.
mm-hmm.
And that was a big, even though she, axed some poor innocent guy to death as part of a drug deal, that was a big, thing. So yeah, she fits all the profile to get the Twitterverse, up in arms and raise money for the Innocence Project, even though, as you said, there's really nothing in the classic Innocence Project playbook around around DNA or actual exculpatory evidence. It's just kind of that emotional appeal of, evil Texas is going to execute a female woman of color.
Yeah. And and my apologies to you. Like I said, I misunderstood. I thought you
No
were
worries,
referring to
it's
Kim
fine.
Kardashian. And I'm like, she's not a person of color. She's freaking European. She's Armenian. They're not people of color. They're from, they're maybe kind of Eastern European. I know Greece is part of Europe. Turkey's part of Europe, but it's kind of classed with the Middle East because it's predominantly Muslim. But and Armenians were persecuted, and there was Armenian genocide. So we're not saying, her people haven't suffered.
Well, yeah, just like we went off last episode about your amazing encyclopedic knowledge of racehorses. I won't bore the audience with my fascination with that part of the world, all the way from the Byzantine Empire to World War I. So I could go off on a tangent. That part of the world is so fascinating.
Yeah, it is. So anyway, so the trial court denied habeas relief. And I'm going to go through, let me just go through the conclusions. And we'll talk about the facts in more detail some other time. The first conclusion of law was that Lucio's statement was not coerced. The second was that the contract therapist with CPS was not acting in concert with police when he counseled Lucio. That Lucio failed to show counsel was deficient in any manner. That where she alleged deficiency, she failed to show the outcome of her trial would have been different. That she failed to show counsel's actions were not sound trial strategy. Because sometimes, sometimes it's thinking on your feet. Not utilizing the CPS records could have been because there was harmful information in it. So you have to be very careful, because if you start asking about how the kids don't say Lucio abused them, then you've got the state coming cross-examining and saying, well, what about here? Or what about this, where they found that she abused Gabriel? So those kind of things are sound trial strategy. Not accusing Alexandra, not trying to accuse Robert Alvarez. Those are sound trial strategies. The court did not abuse its discretion in excluding Villanueva and Pinkerman. That the state did not violate Brady with its disclosures of the CPS records and Maggie's house interviews. That Lucio failed to show voluntary or involuntary facial expressions by the court constituted a statement on the evidence. Apparently, after Dr. Curry, her medical expert, left the stand, her attorney, Gilman, said, Your Honor, you've been making facial expressions. I'd appreciate it if you didn't do that. Of course, the court had no idea what Gilman was talking about because there was no context. And Gilman didn't say, well, when he said ABC, you did this. And I think Gilman was just playing to the jury, making them think the judge did something that he shouldn't have been doing. The court also found that the record was complete because Lucio raised a complaint about the failure of a written, not having a written transcript of her police interviews. That the affidavits of her sister and her mother failed to support innocence by clear and convincing standard. I think they were actually saying that they knew Alexandra had killed Mariah. That Lucio's claim that she was never alone with Mariah was contradicted by the record and did not support innocence by a clear and convincing standard, and that she was not entitled to habeas relief. So, and all of those things that have already been decided, it's very unlikely that she's going to present anything that's going to change that outcome. So, the Court of Criminal Appeals denied relief without written opinion. Now, leading up to her execution, and this is where we're going to have to, we are going to have to come back to this, because a lot of paper was, a lot of trees were killed in my research of all the things that went on leading up to this day of execution. Lucio filed a suggestion to reconsider her initial habeas claims on the court's own motion and a stay of execution. 2 amicus briefs were filed in support of that, or 1 amicus brief was filed by whom, I don't know. And I'm waiting for the Attorney General's office. Sorry, my brain went blank to see if I can get copies of those.
That's okay. It's not your fault. Kim Kardashian will make many people's brains go blank.
And the state filed its response. There were multiple motions to appear pro hoc vice, which were all denied. And then the suggestion to reconsider and motion for stay of execution were also denied. That was yesterday. And that was, like I said, that was her first full state post-conviction claim. Now, she also did pursue federal habeas and pretty much pursued the same issues. I think there were 25 issues, but the court found most of them lacked merit, and some of them were procedurally defaulted because they weren't raised or presented in state court, or issues raised and presented in state court were kind of repackaged and re-argued in a different way in the federal claim. And so the district court granted the director's motion for summary judgment and denied and dismissed her habeas claim without prejudice, with prejudice rather. Lucio appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal. Initially, the panel granted relief on a claim of basically, she claimed that she was deprived of a complete defense when the court refused to let her experts testify about her confession and during the guilt innocence phase of the trial. Again, this is something that is generally not allowed. You can't have an expert come in and say the confession is false. Acquit. You must acquit. It's just not done. I mean, we remember all the controversy about Dr. Offshay and how his testimony was limited. That was because he can't come in and say, well, this is a false confession. It's not true. And you can't convict him. Because it's up to the jury to decide whether the confession is true or not. And they don't need Offshay to tell them whether it is false or true. That was appealed, and the state, of course, appealed, and the rehearing en banc was granted with the full court. I think it's a full court. I'm not sure. It's an awful lot of judges. That was decided on the 9th of February, 2021. And the majority or plurality, because I think it was like the same number for and against. So, but that majority, that became the opinion that mattered. The dissents don't matter. They never do. And that was decided that the relitigation bar applied and the claim had been adjudicated in state court, that the Texas court did not unreasonably apply Crane versus Kentucky in direct appeal in finding that the experts shouldn't be allowed to testify, that the witnesses' opinions about the confession were inadmissible under state law, and state court did not affirm a blanket exclusion of evidence regarding Lucio's confession. And they found, one of the things that the court found in examining the record was that in reality, while Pinkerman's proposed testimony was described as being that because she's a battered woman, she's going to agree with whatever police say. In reality, Pinkerman's report and his proffered testimony never mentioned a battered woman syndrome or that Lucio would take the blame for anything. And then it's a very long opinion. It's very critical of the dissenting opinions, even going to probably what would be hyperbole and rhetoric, and perhaps even, what was it? Well, my friend of mine used to use the term, and I can't remember, where you just attack somebody for the sake of attacking them. And there was a concurring opinion by Judge Southwick. Basically, he just said he couldn't accept the legal reasoning by the dissenters. And he found that for Lucio to succeed on her claim, Crane had to do more, and that his opinion was based on the interplay of his interpretation of the limitations of AEDPA and Crane. And again, we have to consider that under the law as it stands, federal courts can't sit in judgment of state courts and just overrule them to overrule them.
Right.
They're not free to make their own determinations. They're bound by the
Exactly.
determinations made by state court. So, and then there were dissents by Higginbotham. Higginbotham really actually angered me a little bit because he had the audacity to refer to her as Melissa and to refer to Mariah as the victim. And I think it should have been the other way around. It should have been Lucio instead of Melissa, and instead of the victim, it should have been Mariah.
Exactly.
And he was critical of CPS and the death penalty for the most part. Elrod found that didn't agree. He didn't agree that the complete defense claim had been exhausted in state court, or he believed the defense claim had been exhausted in state court and that the state court's determination of it was unreasonable. And then the dissents, basically, the main dissent was that the evidence refuting the core of the state's case, which was a confession, not true, was deemed irrelevant by the state court in an unreasonable application of Supreme Court precedent, and was critical of the majority opinion. But again, they weren't allowed to testify because you can't put an expert on the stand to say a confession is true or not true. That's a determination for the jury. They don't need an expert to tell them that. She filed an appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court, or petition for writ of certiorari, and that was on July 9th, 2021. There were amicus briefs by the Innocence Project and Innocence Network, and former prosecutors, anti-violence organizations, and experts in the field of gender-based violence, which, again, this was a Hispanic woman, a Hispanic victim. This was a female perpetrator, a female victim. This was not a case of a husband killing a wife after a history of domestic violence. This was a mother killing a child.
Exactly.
I mean, because she
Yeah,
claims to be a battered woman, that doesn't excuse.
Yeah, and that's where I think it's, I'm glad that's a really good way to think about it, because I think I've been struggling with, you know, be, the whole idea of, you're a battered woman, that might give you an excuse to set your husband's bed on fire while he's asleep, but that
Right,
doesn't give you
right.
the excuse to kill your child.
And
being abused isn't should
yeah,
not be carte blanche for committing any crime.
I mean, often kids who are abused become bullies in school, and they pick on the younger, smaller, weaker children. Sometimes mothers who are being abused by their partner, they only way they can take back that power and control is by abusing their kids.
Right.
And again, the impression that I get of Lucio is all of her kids were a means to an end. They were a check. And she kept having them when others were moved out of the house. So she would always have that source of income. And then she didn't use it to take care of the kids. She used it to buy drugs because that was more important. I mean, she's a selfish, self-centered, narcissistic person. You're only good for what you can do for her.
Yeah, no, you're right.
So, and I didn't see a lot of former prosecutors. When I looked through the, certificate of interested person, I saw a lot of, battered women's organizations and things like that. I did not see former prosecutors. I saw social workers. I don't know, and that doesn't make just because they're former prosecutors doesn't make their opinion on the issue any more relevant than anyone else's. The state of Texas responded on September 13th, 2021, and a reply was filed on September 28th, 2021. The case was distributed for conference on the 30th of September, and the petition was denied on October 18th, 2021, which set the stage for the Cameron County seeking an execution date. Initially, one was granted. I don't have the date that happened. There was apparently a flaw or a problem with the order, and so it was vacated and a new order, an amended order, was granted on July 18th, 2022. Then, in response to that, Lucio filed a writ of mandamus seeking to disqualify the DA and the judge because Peter Gilman had taken a position with the district attorney's office in 2009. Well, guess what? The time to have raised that issue was, can you say it, Kyle? 2009, when Gilman took the job.
Exactly.
And the brief argues that, he's not cooperating with her current attorneys because he works for the DA. It's like he's been working for the DA since her state and federal habeas were going on. So why is it a problem suddenly now? And then his wife, who had been his former paralegal, is working for the judge in Cameron County, who's not Judge Nelson. It's a different judge. I think Garcia, but don't quote me. And so for some reason, because his former paralegal now works for the judge, somehow the Innocence Project is prevented from contacting the judge's office or having the judge decide anything. So they were also seeking removal of the DA and the judge, and withdrawal of the execution date by Cameron County. The court requested a response. The DA filed a response, but the judge has not filed a response. The court has conditionally granted mandamus relief. They're giving the judge 3 days from yesterday to act on Lucio's motion to recuse. And they also denied the motion to stay execution. Then there was another petition and a motion for stay of execution filed. I don't know what those were, however, because for some reason, the Attorney General is not involved. So I'm probably going to have to go to the Court of Criminal Appeals to get those briefs.
To get that fair.
Yeah. Although I might send a Freedom of Information to Cameron County and see what I get. But that was the motion for leave was denied without written order. So whatever they were asking in this other post-conviction claim, it was denied without written order. But I'm going to have to go to the Court of Criminal Appeals or Cameron County to find out what the heck that was. And then finally, she's filed a new writ, state post-conviction writ. She also filed a federal, tried to file a successive federal habeas writ at the same time. Because the Innocence Project, in addition to the fact that they can't win in court, so they're going to play to the court of public opinion, they also hedge their bets. So they go to state court and they go to federal court. And they see which one is
They just keep, right.
Yeah. Which one is going to fall for it. So basically, they raised a lot of issues, and I'm going to read them because some of them are pretty ridiculous. The first one, of course, is false testimony that Farley and Escalon were lying, that they've met the Chavez requirements of proving false testimony, and that they're entitled to merits review because they've made a prima facie showing of innocence. Because if they were lying, Melissa Lucio has to be innocent. They claim in ground 2 that there's new scientific evidence that the bite marks weren't bite marks. And interestingly enough, again, the bite mark observed on Mariah's shoulder was confirmed by an odontologist. And probably one of the reasons that was allowed in through Farley's testimony was because the odontologist couldn't match it to Melissa. To Lucio. But I digress. Then there is new evidence of confirmation bias. That is one of the ridiculous ones. Because if you say the police had confirmation bias, I say, Innocence Project, you have confirmation bias. You want her to be innocent. And so you're going to find only what proves her innocent.
Right.
And you're going to ignore anything that proves her guilty. You can look at pictures of that child's body all day long, and you're going to say, nope, clotting disorder, not bruises. Or not from abuse, but from a clotting disorder. Blunt trauma to the head, that was from a fall. Steep staircase, no corroboration, but I'll believe what they say. That's confirmation bias. New scientific evidence on false confession. I don't know how you can get scientific evidence on a false confession. I'll be interested to see what the hell that's all about. And new scientific evidence regarding demeanor reading. Apparently, Escalon testified about his observations and his experience as to what that body language often arose from in a person's interactions with police. And now they're saying, well, that was total hokum, and we have scientific proof that it was hokum. That's kind of ridiculous. The bite mark shit, again, urodontologists, that's one of the reasons bite marks have pretty much been shoved to the wayside as evidence. They were once considered pretty reliable, but now they're not, because 3 odontologists can look at the exact same thing and all 3 come to a different conclusion or opinion. So ground 3 is new evidence that no murder occurred. This is probably kids now saying, well, I definitely saw Alexandra push her down the stairs. And
but just to be clear, though, nobody's actually said that, right? Like, nobody's ever posited.
Well, I believe
an alternative crime.
I believe I saw an affidavit from one of the children when I was looking at evidence at appendices filed in the Fifth Circuit, and it was late and I was tired, but I believe one of the children has now said, I saw Alexandra push her down the stairs. I could be mistaken. I could have just seen it, but it wasn't really there because I was just tired and I was aggravated of going through 500 something pages when I really wanted to go to bed. But I couldn't stop. So, but yeah, I think they've gotten a couple of the kids to come forward and say they saw something other than what really happened. Because again, the kids, and whatever kids testify to this, if they said they saw her fall in the new apartment down 3 stairs, they're going to have a problem on the stand. And things are not going to go well, I don't think, for Lucio's witnesses. It's going to be like the hearing with Rodney Reed's witnesses. They're going to have a lot of splaining to do. So then they raised ineffective assistance of counsel, suppression of evidence by the state, Sixth Amendment violations in pretrial interrogation, juror misconduct, gender bias, and actual innocence of the death penalty, false testimony regarding her future dangerousness. The motion to stay was granted, and part of the reason for that is that she didn't file this writ until April 19th, when she was a little bit more than a week away from execution. And there's no way the TCCA could have made a good decision. Well, it would have been irresponsible for them to just deny it, because the number of claims raised and the volume of material they provided in support of the claims.
Mm-hmm.
They've also rendered this or remanded this case with amici from people in support of Lucio and no response from the state. So the state's response will be very interesting. And so the motion to stay execution was granted, and 4 of the claims were remanded. Claim 1 on false testimony, claim 2, the scientific evidence, claim 3, actual innocence, and claim 5, the Brady violation. And the TCCA found claim 4, claim 6, claim 7, claim 8, and claim 9 all to be complete and utter bullshit, in my humble opinion, because they didn't remand them. And then again, she filed she tried to have the mandate recalled in her former Fifth Circuit appeal. and she filed a request to file a successive writ of habeas corpus in a new matter. And an opposition was filed, and she replied, and there was no decision last night as of about 9:30 or 10 o'clock on that. So that's Lucio for tonight.
So as usual, a lot of this where a lot of strong evidence that the convicted did it, but the Innocence Project and celebrities have stepped in to throw a bunch of stuff against the wall
to see what sticks and to play to the court of public opinion. That's really, all anybody is ever going to hear. It's just like with Rodney Reed. All they're going to hear is Brady violation, and they're not going to look beyond the fact that it wasn't a Brady violation because this Rodney Reed had access to it. Like the beer cans. They still claim that was a Brady violation. And he had access to the same evidence. He tested the same evidence. He got the same result. His expert went one step further, and that eliminated those beer cans as being relevant evidence in his case altogether. And you can argue about whether it really is eliminated or not. But, at the time of trial, his expert could not be questioned about those beer cans, because if she was, and she tried to portray him as exculpatory, her credibility would have been completely, totally, utterly destroyed by the state, because they would have had her further testing that had eliminated the beer cans. And I think that's another thing that people don't realize. While there's generally not a right of discovery owed to the state by a defendant, if an expert is going to testify, you have to provide that expert's reports about everything that expert's going to testify to. So if the expert was going to testify about the beer cans, they would have had their reports about the beer cans, all of them. Now, granted, yes, Lydia Clay Jackson has said, well, maybe we would have not put on our expert and pretended the beer cans were exculpatory. But that would be unethical for them to do that if they knew the beer cans were not exculpatory. So, but they look at it like it's in a vacuum. They're still claiming Martha Barnett and Mary Blackwell's statements are credible. So,
right. Yeah, that's.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, it's exactly right. I mean, I try to think about this as, how does somebody who has read about the case in the popular press sort of digest this? And I think that's a lot of it is the popular press kind of cherry picks things that sound really scary without ever sort of taking that second and third order, analysis to really understand what that means.
And it's getting scary because just like the writ granted for Rodney Reed, there are purportedly intelligent, quote, journalists who claim to cover the courts and know the courts, who are saying the Supreme Court is going to decide if he gets DNA testing. And that is not what the Supreme Court could not say, Texas, you have to DNA test. Because Texas doesn't have to do what the Supreme Court tells them to.
No, exactly.
They don't have the authority to tell Texas you have to grant him DNA testing. All they're going to be looking at is whether or not you file as soon as the state denies, or you file after you've appealed and gone through the court process within the state. So at most, a decision in Rodney Reed's favor in Supreme Court is only going to revive his federal challenge to denial of DNA. And once the statute of limitations issue even if that is decided in his favor and he goes back, it's doubtful whether or not the federal court can do anything, because the federal court doesn't have the power to tell a state court that it has to grant DNA testing. It can maybe say his rights are being denied, but
Right.
I don't think it's going to, and really the reason he's being denied DNA testing in state court is because he doesn't qualify under the statute, because his conviction is based on DNA. So we'll have to see where that goes.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Two really interesting cases that have gotten the celebrities worked up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, all right. Well, I think we've covered it, and we will revisit Lucio once there's findings of fact in her state post-conviction claim. We'll talk about it, and it'll be interesting to go into more depth with her first state post-conviction and compare the claims presented and how they were presented, and then contrast with how the Innocence Project, because they mostly repackage.
Yep.
And another thing
Right.
that they do is they bring in all these experts that say the trial experts didn't know what they were talking about, they were lying, and I know what I'm doing, and I'm beyond reproach, and what I say goes. And so,
yeah, because nothing says credibility like an expert paid for by the Innocence Project.
well, they've somehow managed to get it so that most of their experts are pro bono.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm sure they're pro bono for that trial, but then they get very lucrative speaking engagements.
And I think that's where,
yeah,
I think that's where they're doing. And it'd be interesting to see if a DA, well, what kind of compensation do you get? Because I mean, they said Bodden flew down on his own dime. And they were saying at the last hearing that Baker flew down on his own dime. The other one couldn't leave Kentucky. Davis, I think.
Well, and that's the thing on a lot of these deals where people don't understand that, money is fungible, right? It's like, okay, Baker's going to fly down on his own dime. Yes, that is true. He is testifying for free. That is absolutely right.
But does he submit his expenses later?
The next week, the Innocence Project is paying him $100,000 to do a brown bag for the local office talking about, DNA testing. I mean, yeah, technically he may not be getting paid for this particular trial, but I'm sure he is getting paid, if not out of the right pocket, out of the left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's call it a night. It's very late. Thank you so much for being patient with me tonight.
Well, thank you for
had to
doing all
finish
this
my
work.
dinner.
It's a tough case to have to listen to. I mean, a child being murdered by her mother is just horrible. And especially as remind everybody, poor Mariah still does not have a headstone at the Harlingen Cemetery.
Yes. And I want to say, if you live in the Harlingen area, my faithful listeners, and anybody, there is a stone company, a memorial company there, and I have looked at headstones and the little flat markers. Private message me on Facebook or Twitter if we can get something together with a group of people to anonymously buy something. And if you know somebody in the Harlingen area that could kind of facilitate getting that ordered and paid for and installed, so that this child does not continue resting in an unmarked grave that would be really great, because apparently her Alvarez siblings, her Lucio siblings, her grandmother, her grandparents on either side, her father, none of these people has seen fit to try to even provide her with a headstone. I understand the family was poor, and I understand financially strapped most of the time, but you manage when you want to do it. And among 13 siblings or 11 siblings, I'm sure that they could have put together $500 or $600 to buy something to mark their sister's grave.
And definitely something the Innocence Project could probably fund out of its petty cash.
Yeah, I would like to send something like that. And I'll bet you that they are totally unaware that Mariah is in an unmarked grave. And I bet that the people, Lucio's advocates, who hear that are going to call me a liar. But, well, okay, maybe Find a Grave isn't a trustworthy source, but according to Find a Grave, Mariah's grave is unmarked. And I challenge anybody who wants to say I'm lying, fine, go to Harlingen, go to the cemetery, and take a picture of Mariah's headstone. And I'll eat my words. So, all right. Well, that is, I think on that note, before I fight with somebody, because that makes me mad. I don't mind being proven wrong, but prove me wrong. Don't just tell me I'm wrong.
Exactly.
So if you want to tell me I'm wrong, please post a picture of the headstone. Thank you for listening to Based in Fact, a true crime podcast. If you like the show and want to know more, you can find us on Facebook or follow me on Twitter at O'Brien L. Ann. Join us next week for episode 10, where Kyle and I will talk to Joe Nevels and Natalie Voss Nevels about the 148th Kentucky Derby. The annual Run for the Roses will be held at Churchill Downs on May 7th, 2022. The appearance of Joe and Natalie on our show will make this the only true crime podcast that can claim 2 Eclipse Award-winning writers as guests. I'm also curious to see the dynamic between Joe and Natalie in an interview. In advance of the show, you can find Joe and Natalie's articles and features at the Pollock Report or on their website. Links will be posted in the show description. Until then, have a great week and stay safe. Good night.